He didn't threaten me. He didn't charm me. He just watched. And somehow that was worse. My name is Sonia. I came to Seoul with one plan: disappear. Start over somewhere nobody knew what California had taken from me. I took a job nobody else wanted in a penthouse that felt like it was holding its breath, working for a man that 2 armed bodyguards wouldn't look in the eye without permission. I told myself I was just there to clean. Then a white envelope appeared on my counter, my name on the front, no signature. 4 words inside: your past follows you. Someone in his world had been watching me, and the man everyone in that building deferred to, Kwon Suk-chin, pulled that card out, looked at me, and said, "I already knew. I know the difference." That was the moment I understood. I was already in deeper than I planned, and walking away was no longer as simple as I needed it to be. If you've ever started over somewhere you didn't know, somewhere nobody owed you anything, and you didn't have a single person in your corner, you know what my first hour in that penthouse felt like. And if you do, follow this channel, because Sonia's story is only just beginning. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever walked into a room knowing you had to prove yourself before you even opened your mouth?
The first thing I learned about his house was that silence wasn't peaceful. It was controlled. Not the kind of quiet you find in an empty apartment, where dust settles and pipes knock and the building breathes on its own schedule. This was different. This was a silence that had been arranged. Every surface too clean, every object too precisely placed, every light calibrated to say nothing happens here by accident. I noticed it within 30 seconds of stepping off the private elevator. My placement agency had called it a domestic management role. I'd learned to translate that kind of language years ago. It meant I was invisible by design, present enough to keep everything running, absent enough to never be remembered. That was fine with me. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant I could do my work, collect my pay, and keep rebuilding what California had taken from me. I set my bag down in the service quarters without touching anything I didn't need to. Force of habit. You learn, after a certain kind of betrayal, to leave small marks on the world, not no marks, but small ones, controllable ones. The briefing from the agency had been thorough and notably short on warmth. Mr. Kwon valued punctuality, precision, and discretion. He did not require conversation. He did not require opinions. He required a person who could manage a 43rd floor penthouse in Gangnam as though it ran itself, and who would ask no questions about the hours he kept or the people who sometimes arrived without being announced. I could do all of that. I'd done it before, in houses far less clean than this one. My first task was the bedroom. The door was ajar, which is the only reason I pushed it further open without thinking. A partially open door in domestic work is an invitation to clean. That's not an assumption, that's a protocol. You learn the language of doors fast in this kind of job. Closed means private. Open means enter. Half open means whoever lives here was in a hurry and doesn't expect you yet. I was wrong about the last part. He was sitting on the edge of the bed. Not lying down, not distracted, not on his phone. Sitting, jacket off, shirt collar open, forearms resting on his knees, completely still. Like a man who had sat down to think and gotten so deep into it that the rest of the world had simply gone ahead without him. He looked up the moment I pushed the door. I didn't apologize, not immediately. I know that sounds like arrogance, but it wasn't, it was assessment. In the half second before my mouth opened, I was reading the room. Was he startled? No. Was he angry? Not yet. Was he waiting to see what I would do? Yes, that one. Definitely that one. I'll come back, I said. 3 words. Calm, flat, professional. No scrambling, no over-explaining. I was already pulling the door back toward its original position when he spoke. You're the new one. Not a question, a categorization. Sonia Adonis, I said. I start today. He looked at me the way people look at something they weren't expecting to find interesting. Not rude, precise. Like he was filing information in real time, and I happened to be the thing being filed. I held his gaze. I don't know why, exactly instinct, maybe, or something older than instinct. I've spent too many years being looked through to make the mistake of looking away first. That's not pride talking. That's just how I'm built now. After a moment, he said, "The linen is changed on Wednesdays." "I know," I said. "I read the service notes." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, more like a recalibration. A tiny adjustment, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. I pulled the door closed and walked back to the kitchen. I made myself useful the way I always do, systematically, without drama. I inventoried the kitchen, noted what was stocked, what was missing, what had been ignored long enough to expire. I wiped down surfaces that were already clean, because clean in someone else's estimation and clean in mine are not the same thing. I found the household schedule in a drawer, printed, laminated, color-coded, and I read it twice. By early afternoon, I'd mapped the entire service side of the apartment. I knew where the spare linens were kept, which thermostat controlled which zone, how the recycling was organized, and why the third burner on the range ran slightly hotter than the others. I didn't see him again until evening. He moved through the apartment the way the silence moved, completely and without announcement. One moment the kitchen was empty. The next, he was standing at the far end of it, jacket back on, phone in hand, not looking at me but aware of me in the particular way that people with power are always aware of the people around them. I was slicing ginger for the broth I'd started an hour ago. He didn't say anything about it, didn't ask what I was making or why, but he paused at the counter, just for a beat, and I watched him register the smell in a way he didn't intend to show. Something in his shoulders dropped, barely, the way a person breathes out without meaning to. I went back to slicing. 2 men came to the door at 9. I heard them before the intercom rang, voices in the hallway, a particular kind of low and careful that tells you people are choosing their words. When I passed the entrance to let them in per protocol, both of them stopped mid-sentence and looked at me the way people look at something that doesn't fit their expectations. Neither of them looked at me for long. They looked at him instead, for permission to keep moving, and he gave them a look I couldn't read from across the room, but they could. They went straight to his office without another glance in my direction. I cataloged that. Not because it alarmed me, but because information is the only currency I fully trust. A man who can stop a conversation with a look and redirect 2 grown men without speaking a word, that's not incidental. That's practice. That's a specific kind of authority that doesn't come from a title. I finished cleaning the kitchen at 10:30 and went to my quarters. Before I closed my door, I stood at the window for a minute, looking out over Gangnam. The city at night doesn't look like it's sleeping. It looks like it's waiting, all that light, all that glass, all that careful arrangement. It reminded me of the apartment, of him. I thought about calling Maya, but it was too late in California. Instead, I sat on the edge of my own bed and wrote in the small notebook I've kept since San Francisco. Not a diary, I don't do those, just notes, things I noticed, things I needed to remember. Day 1, I wrote, "He watches without being seen watching. That takes years to learn." I thought about that for a moment, then added one more line. He didn't tell me to close the door on my way out, but I did anyway. That moment at the doorway, that was the first thing, not the last. If you're the kind of woman who pays attention to the things people don't say, stay with this channel, because every chapter from here gets deeper. And I want to know, when someone watches you that closely for the first time, what do you do, hold still, or give them something worth watching? I turned off the light at 11. The apartment was quiet in the way it always was, arranged, deliberate, controlled. But something had shifted in it, something small, unmeasurable. I couldn't name it, and I wasn't going to try. I closed my eyes and let the city hum beneath me. Tomorrow, I would learn his schedule, learn the rhythms of the space, where it breathed, where it held. Tonight, I would remember that the door hadn't been closed, and that he'd watched me hold my ground and said nothing about it. That was either a warning or a beginning. I didn't know which yet. I've worked in houses where people pretended not to see me, but he saw everything. Not in the way that made my skin crawl, the way certain employers watch domestic staff like they're waiting to catch something. This was different. More like how a person watches a chess board between moves, not hunting, just tracking, cataloging, storing information he hadn't decided what to do with yet. By the third day, I'd confirmed it wasn't my imagination. He never watched me directly. That was the thing. If I looked up, his eyes were always somewhere else. His phone, the window, a document on the counter. But the attention was there. I could feel it the way you feel a draft from a window you can't find. Consistent, sourceless, impossible to ignore once you've noticed it. I decided not to let it change anything about how I worked. That was a choice, not a reflex. I want to be clear about that. On the fourth morning, a man named Han Di-jin arrived at 7:45. I knew who he was from the service briefing. Right hand, operations, don't address unless addressed. He came in without knocking, which told me everything about his rank in this space, and stood in the kitchen doorway while I was portioning rice for the meal prep schedule I'd drafted the day before. He watched me for a moment, then, "You're the new housekeeper." "Sonia," I said without turning around. "How long have you been in Korea?" "Long enough." A pause. "Your Korean is limited." "My work doesn't require conversation." Another pause, longer this time. I kept my back to him and kept working. In my experience, men like Di-jin expect one of two responses from people in my position, deference or nervousness. I wasn't going to give him either, and I was curious how long it would take him to recalibrate. "Mr. Kwon has particular requirements," he said finally. "Previous staff understood the nature of this household." I set down the rice cup, turned around, and looked at him directly. "I read the service protocols. I've met every requirement listed. If there's something specific you'd like to add, I'm happy to write it down." He held my gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then his eyes moved to the doorway, just briefly, a reflex, checking whether anyone had heard that exchange. He straightened slightly. "Just making sure you understand your position here," he said. "I understand it fine," I said, and turned back to the counter. He left without responding. I exhaled slowly through my nose and kept portioning rice. The first test came on day 5. I'm almost certain it was deliberate, though I can't prove it. What I know is this. I arrived in the kitchen at 6:15 to find the entire lower cabinet reorganized. Not carelessly, precisely. Everything moved to a different position, but logically, the way someone would rearrange a space if they thought about it differently than the previous person had. It would have thrown off my entire prep routine. Anyone unfamiliar with the change would have spent 20 minutes hunting for things, getting behind, feeling disoriented in a space they thought they knew. I stood there for a moment, took a full inventory with my eyes, mapped the new layout, and started working. I didn't say anything about it, didn't ask who'd done it, didn't leave it undone to make a point. I just adapted, and I moved through the morning prep in the same time I always did. He came through the kitchen at 7:10. I was plating the breakfast tray. He paused, that familiar, almost imperceptible pause, and I could feel him reading the kitchen, reading me. I put the tray on the counter and looked up. "I'll keep the new arrangement," I said. "The spice storage makes more sense closer to the range." Something passed through his expression. Quick, restrained. Not quite surprise, more like a result that had come back different from what he'd entered into the equation. "Good," he said. He took the tray, left the kitchen, that was all. But I stood very still for a moment after he was gone, because I understood what had just happened. He'd moved my things to see how I'd respond, to find out if I'd panic, complain, or quietly put everything back where I'd had it, reasserting my preference over his, marking territory in a way that said I'm not adjusting to you. I'd done neither. I'd adapted without protest and noted the logic in his choice out loud in front of him. What that communicated, whether I'd meant it to or not, was, I'm not here to fight your space, but I'm not afraid of it either. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The second test was less practical and harder to name. On day 7, I came into the living area to find a slim folder on the side table nearest my usual cleaning path. Not hidden, not highlighted, just placed. The agency's letterhead was visible at the top. My initial contract, or a copy of it. I picked it up, checked it over, terms, schedule, NDAs, the standard language. Nothing missing, nothing added. I set it back down exactly where I'd found it and went about my work. At the end of the day, the folder was gone. I don't know what response he expected. Maybe he was checking whether I'd take it somewhere private, whether I'd photograph it, read it anxiously, look for the fine print like someone who didn't know what they'd signed, whether uncertainty or paranoia lived somewhere under my steadiness. It didn't. I knew what I'd signed. I'd read it 3 times before I ever took the placement. But the test itself told me something worth knowing. He wasn't just watching how I worked. He was trying to understand what I was made of, what I could be rattled by, bought by, frightened into. The answer, so far, was nothing he'd tried. That night, I finally called Maya. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear hospital sounds in the background, the soft percussion of a nursing shift winding down. "Tell me something good," she said. "I'm still standing," I said. "That's always good with you." A pause. "Is it bad?" I thought about the cabinet reorganization, the folder, Jin in the doorway, the way Kwon Suk-chin moved through rooms like silence made visible. "It's interesting," I said. Maya had known me long enough to know what that meant. "Be careful, Sonia." "I'm always careful." "That's not the same thing as safe." I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. But careful and safe have never been the same category for me, not since California, not since I learned that safety was something you built for yourself or did without. I told her I'd call again soon and got off the phone. I was in the kitchen at 10:45 when he came back from whatever the evening had held for him. He didn't speak. He poured himself a glass of water from the filter on the counter, not the expensive bottled water stocked in the refrigerator, just the plain filtered water in a plain glass, and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the city. He looked, for exactly that moment, like a man who was tired. Not weak, not vulnerable, just tired. The specific bone-level exhaustion of someone who has been performing precision all day and set it down briefly when they thought no one was paying attention. I finished wiping down the counters and left quietly. I didn't write anything in my notebook that night. Some observations are for keeping, not recording. Power doesn't speak loudly. It sits in the room and waits for you to notice it. I'd been in the penthouse 2 weeks before I understood that what I was living inside wasn't just a home or even a workplace. It was a system. Every person who entered, every call that came through, every meeting that happened behind that office door, it all moved according to a logic I wasn't supposed to understand. I was supposed to clean around it, maintain the surface of it, see nothing. That's not how I'm built. By the end of week 2, I'd noticed the pattern in his nights. The later the hour, the quieter the apartment got, not the usual quiet of a place settling, but a pressurized kind. Like the air itself was holding something back. Lights stayed on in the office past midnight. Jin arrived and left without the usual formality. Voices, when they came at all, were flat and clipped and ended abruptly. Something was wrong in his world. I didn't know what, I didn't ask. But I noticed. The conversation happened on a Tuesday, which I mention only because nothing about Tuesday suggested it would be the day anything changed. I was in the kitchen at 11:15 at night, later than usual, because one of the refrigeration units had been running warm all day, and I'd waited for a replacement part delivered after hours. I was finishing the reinstall when I heard the office door open, not the quiet, controlled close he usually managed, but an actual open, like he'd pushed it wider than intended and didn't bother correcting it. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. Jacket off, sleeves pushed up to the elbow, the first time I'd seen his arms without the full formal armor of his usual clothes. There was a tattoo on his left forearm, partially visible dark ink that disappeared under the rolled fabric. Not decorative, dense, deliberate lines. He looked at the refrigeration unit, then at me. It was running warm, I said. I waited for the part. He didn't say you didn't have to or you could have left it. He just looked at the unit for a moment, then moved to the counter and poured water the same way he always did, the filtered tap, the plain glass. He didn't leave. That was new. He stood at the counter with his water and looked out the window, and I finished what I was doing because the work still needed finishing and standing still to manage his mood wasn't part of my job description. I closed the unit panel, ran a check, confirmed the temperature was dropping correctly. "You're from California," he said. Not a question. He'd read my file. I'd assumed as much weeks ago. "Yes." "You left." "I did." A pause. Outside, the city continued its patient glittering. Down on the street, 43 floors below, taxis moved like slow fish. "Most people who come here from elsewhere," he said, "are running towards something." "I know," I said. "I was running away from something. There's a difference." He looked at me then. Directly, the way he almost never did, not the peripheral cataloging I'd grown used to, but a full, unguarded look that lasted just a beat too long to be professional. "Yes," he said, "there is." I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and folded it over the rack. I wasn't going to ask what he meant. I wasn't going to fill the silence with something warm and curious just because he'd cracked the door open slightly. I knew better than to rush at an opening like that. But I filed it. He knows the difference too. If you've ever rebuilt yourself somewhere no one knew your old name, follow this channel, because this is a story about what happens when two people who have both survived something recognize each other across a room. Drop a comment and tell me, did you ever leave somewhere to save yourself, and did it work? She arrived on a Thursday. Lee Min-seo. I didn't know her name yet when I first saw her. I just knew the apartment changed when she walked into it. Not loudly. That's the thing about women like her. They don't announce themselves with volume. They announce themselves with the way other people rearrange. Di-jin, who moved through this apartment like he owned a share of it, straightened when she came in. Not a bow, too subtle for that. Just a realignment, the body's automatic response to a variable it didn't fully trust. She was polished in the particular way that takes significant effort to look effortless. Silk blouse, minimal jewelry, a handbag that cost more than 3 months of my salary and was carried like she'd forgotten it was there. She spoke to Suk-chin in Korean I only partially followed, fluid, social, calibrated. The kind of Korean that had rooms in it, corridors, places you weren't invited. He responded in short sentences. She laughed at something and touched his arm briefly. Fingertips only, 2 seconds, removed before it registered as anything. But her eyes moved to me while she did it. That was deliberate. I know a territorial signal when I see one. I was refilling the water on the side table, which is a task that takes approximately 45 seconds and required me to be in that room for exactly that long and no longer. I finished it, set the carafe down precisely, and moved toward the door. "The housekeeper," she said in English, directed at Suk-chin about me while I was standing there. The grammar of that, the housekeeper, not your housekeeper, certainly not my name, was architectural. It was building something. "Sonia," I said before he could answer. Calm, flat, professional, I looked at her directly. "Sonia Adonis." A half-beat of silence. Her smile didn't move, but something behind it did. A door closing. "Of course," she said. I left the room. In the hallway, I kept my pace even and my face neutral because the hallway had ears, and this apartment had eyes, and I had learned, in 31 years of living in the world, that the most dangerous thing you can do in front of a person like Lee Min-seo is let her see that she landed. She hadn't landed, but she'd been aiming. I went back to the kitchen and started on the evening close-down. Dishes, surfaces, the quiet choreography of ending a day in someone else's house. My hands were steady. My mind was not rattled, but running, cataloging, the way it does when it sniffs out a pattern before I've consciously named it. She wasn't here because of business, or not only. She was here to look at something. And partway through the evening I had arrived at a suspicion I didn't particularly want. That what she'd looked at, when she touched his arm and let her eyes slide to me, was whether I was a problem she needed to solve. I had no interest in being a problem. I had no interest in his world, his complications, the specific gravity of whatever Lee Min-seo represented in it. But I had less interest in being pushed. He came to the kitchen after she'd gone. He didn't say anything about her. Didn't explain, didn't apologize, didn't offer any of the social smoothing that people do when they know someone in their orbit has been pointed at you like a question. What he did was this. He stood at the counter, and after a moment he said, "The broth you made last week, is there more?" There was. I'd portioned and frozen it 3 days ago. I heated it without comment, poured it into the same plain bowl he always used, not the formal ware, the everyday ceramic, and set it in front of him. He sat down at the kitchen counter, not the dining table. The kitchen counter, where the light was practical and unglamorous, and there was nothing formal about any of it. He ate in silence. I finished the close down. If you've ever had someone look through you in a room like you weren't a person, and stood there anyway without shrinking, follow this channel, because Sonia is just getting started, and the woman who walked in tonight is not done. Drop a comment and tell me. Can you always tell when someone has decided you're a threat before you've said a single word? I turned off the kitchen light at midnight. Behind me, I heard the soft scrape of the bowl being set down. Then nothing. I didn't look back. But walking to my quarters, I was thinking about what he'd said. Most people who come here are running toward something, and the specific weight of the fact that he hadn't asked me what I was running from. He'd acknowledged it and left it alone. In my experience, that kind of restraint is either respect or strategy. I hadn't decided which yet, but I was thinking about it. I knew the moment things changed, because he stopped pretending I wasn't part of his world. It happened on a Friday. Not gradually, not the slow accumulation of small moments I'd been cataloging for weeks. 1 hour I was the housekeeper. The next, I was something else, and neither of us had agreed to that out loud. The envelope arrived mid-morning. I found it on the kitchen counter when I came in from the service corridor, plain, white, unsealed, my name written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Not his, someone else's. The letters were precise in the way that suggests the writer was being careful, not natural. Inside was a single card, no signature, 4 words in English. Your past follows you. I stood there for a moment reading it twice. Then I set it down, finished unloading the supply delivery I'd been in the middle of, and went to find Jin. He was in the hallway outside the office. The moment I held up the card, his expression shifted, not surprise, something faster and more controlled than surprise. "When did this arrive?" he said. "It was on the counter when I came in, 20 minutes ago, maybe less." He took it from me without touching the card itself, holding it by the envelope edges. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me, reading me the way people in this apartment were always reading me, checking for panic, for weakness, for the specific kind of fear that makes people unpredictable. I gave him nothing to read. "I'll handle it," he said. "I'd like to know what it means," I said. "That's not." Jin, I kept my voice even. "Someone came into this apartment and left something with my name on it. That's not a household matter, that's a security matter, and it involves me directly, so I'd like to know what it means." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he went into the office and closed the door. I went back to the kitchen and kept working, because stopping wouldn't change anything, and movement is how I manage the part of my brain that wants to catastrophize. I knew what your past follows you was referencing. The accusation in California. The theft charge that was never prosecuted but never fully erased. Either the kind of thing that lives in background checks and quiet conversations between people who know people. Someone had been looking into me. That meant someone had decided I was worth looking into. Lee Min-seo. I didn't have proof. I had pattern recognition and 3 weeks of watching how she operated. The office door opened 40 minutes later. Suk-chin came out alone. He walked into the kitchen and stopped at the counter. He didn't have the card. He didn't have anything. He just stood there, and the quality of his stillness was different from usual, tighter, more deliberate. Like a person holding something back by keeping very, very still. "You were accused of theft," he said. "In California, 3 years ago." "Framed," I said. "My employer embezzled funds and needed somewhere for it to land. The charge was dropped. My name was cleared." Quietly. Yes, quietly. I set down the knife I'd been using and looked at him directly. Because that's how those things work when the person who did it has more lawyers than you do. You get your name back, but not your reputation. So you go somewhere else and you start over. He was watching me with that particular focus that I'd come to understand meant he was deciding something. "I already knew," he said. I paused. "About California." "Before you were placed here, I review all staff files personally." Something clarified in my chest, not warmth exactly, but the specific relief of a thing you suspected being confirmed. He'd known from the beginning. The tests, the watching, the careful attention, none of it had been about the accusation. He'd already decided that wasn't the truth of me. "Then why are you telling me now?" I said. "Because someone else is using it, and I want you to know that I know the difference." I left the kitchen and went to the rooftop terrace. Not because I was given permission, because I needed air and I was going to get it, and no one in that apartment was in a position to tell me otherwise. I stood at the railing and looked out over Gangnam, the glass and the light and the stacked wealth of it, and I gave myself exactly 5 minutes to feel everything I'd been holding flat all morning. Anger mostly, the specific clarifying kind. I was not afraid of Lee Min-seo. I want to be precise about that. Fear and alertness are different things, and what I felt standing on that rooftop was alert, tuned, sharp, ready. Someone had reached into my history to try to make me small, and instead it had made me very, very focused. I heard the terrace door open behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew his footsteps by now, the particular weight and pace of them. He came to stand at the railing, not beside me but near me, a foot of distance. He looked out at the city the way I was looking at it, not like he owned it, but like he understood its cost. "You should have told me someone was escalating toward you," he said. "I didn't know it was escalation yet," I said. "I thought it was posturing." "Min-seo doesn't posture." "I'm starting to understand that." A pause. Below us, the city hummed its constant note. "I'll handle her," he said. Something in the way he said it, flat, final, no performance in it, made the back of my neck prickle. Not fear. Recognition. This was the version of him that existed behind the controlled stillness, behind the plain water glasses and the kitchen counter and the quiet chess moves. This was what Jin straightened for, what those 2 men had checked his face for before moving. "I don't need you to handle anyone on my behalf," I said. "I know," he turned to look at me. "That's not why I'm doing it." I looked at him then. Full on, the way we'd looked at each other in that first doorway 3 weeks ago. And for the first time since I'd arrived in this apartment, I didn't know exactly what I was seeing. Not threat, not strategy. Something with less armor on. "There's a line," I said, "between my life and yours, between what I do here and what your world is. I need that line to stay where it is." He was quiet for a moment. "Lines move," he said, "when things change around them." "Then I need to know when they're moving," I said. "I need to not find out from an unsigned card on my kitchen counter." He held my gaze. Something settled in him, not submission, not agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement. The specific kind that means I hear you and I'm not dismissing it. "You'll know," he said. I nodded once, turned back to the city. We stood there for another minute, not speaking, the skyline doing all the work between us. When I went back inside, I didn't feel safer exactly, but I felt something more useful than safe. I felt like I was standing on ground I'd chosen, not ground I'd been placed on. That was new, and I wasn't sure yet whether it was the beginning of something or the last clear moment before everything got complicated. Probably both. I've left before without looking back, but this time, I needed to know why I wanted to stay. My bag was half packed on the bed when I stopped. Not because someone asked me to stop. Not because I heard a sound in the hallway or reconsidered the money or ran out of places to go. I stopped because I was standing there folding a shirt I'd bought in Gangnam 6 weeks ago, a simple gray thing I'd picked up from a market stall 2 streets over, and I realized I liked it here. Not the penthouse. Not him. Here. The market. The filtered light in the kitchen at 6 in the morning. The way the city looked from 43 floors up, when it was still deciding what kind of day to be. That was the problem. I'd started to belong to a place I had no business belonging to. I set the shirt down and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about California. Not the accusation, I'd processed that years ago, turned it over until it lost its power. I thought about the morning I left, how clean it had felt, how I'd told myself that clean was the same as free and almost believed it, how I'd been mistaking the absence of pain for the presence of peace ever since, and getting away with it because I was always moving fast enough that the difference didn't catch up with me. It had caught up with me here. I found him on the rooftop. This surprised me because it was early, not yet 7, and in 5 weeks I had never seen him on the rooftop at any hour that wasn't late. He was standing at the far railing with his back to the door, jacket on despite the hour, hands in his pockets. The city below was doing its morning thing, taxis and delivery trucks, and the particular organized chaos of Gangnam waking up. I almost went back inside. Instead, I walked to the railing and stood near him. Not beside him, near him. I've learned the difference matters in spaces like this. He didn't turn around. He said, "You're up early." "I was packing," I said. A pause. He turned then, not sharply, just a slow pivot, the kind that means a person is managing their reaction before they show it. "And," he said. And I stopped. He looked at me for a moment, then he turned back to the city. "Why?" That was the question I'd been sitting with for 40 minutes on the edge of my bed. I'd tried 3 different answers, and none of them were fully honest, which is the only kind of answer I know how to give. "Because leaving felt like running," I said, "and I'm tired of running being my first language." He was quiet for long enough that I started to think he wasn't going to respond. That was fine. I hadn't said it for a response. I'd said it because it was true, and I needed to hear it out loud in the open air where it couldn't be taken back. Then he said, "I was going to let you go." I looked at him. "If you'd come to me this morning with your bag," he said, "I would have arranged the settlement, called the agency, and let you go." He kept his eyes on the city. "I wasn't going to ask you to stay." "Why not?" "Because you don't stay for someone else's reasons." He said it like it was a fact he'd worked out carefully, not a compliment. "You stay for your own." Something settled in my chest. Not softness, something sturdier than that. The specific feeling of being understood by someone who hasn't asked you to explain yourself. "That's correct," I said. "I know." Below us, a delivery truck made a sound like the city clearing its throat. Somewhere further out a phone rang and went unanswered. "Minseo," I said. "Is it handled?" "Yes." "I don't need the details." "I know that too." I considered him, the profile of him, the composed, unhurried quality that I'd spent 5 weeks reading wrong. I'd called it control. It wasn't entirely. It was discipline, which is a different thing. Control is about keeping everything out. Discipline is about choosing what you let in and holding it carefully once it's there. He'd been holding things carefully for a very long time. "I'm going to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to answer it honestly." He turned to look at me fully. "Is staying here safe for me?" I said. "Not comfortable, not convenient. Safe, tell me the truth." He held my gaze and didn't answer immediately, which I respected more than I would have respected a quick yes. He was thinking about it, actually thinking, not performing reassurance. "No," he said, "not completely. My world carries risk I can reduce but not eliminate." A pause. "What I can tell you is that I will not be the source of it, and that what happened with the card, that won't happen again." "You can't promise that." "No," he said. "I can promise that anyone who tries it again will understand very clearly that you are not a variable they can use." The way he said it, flat, unhurried, with the specific weight of a man whose statements don't require volume to be believed. Told me he meant it in ways I didn't need spelled out. I nodded once. "Then I'll stay," I said, "on my terms." "Tell me your terms." "If you've ever needed someone to ask you that, not assume, not decide for you, just ask, follow this channel, because that question changes everything between Sonia and Suk-chin from this moment forward. Drop a comment and tell me. What would your terms be? What's the one thing you'd need before you trusted someone with your real self?" I thought about it for a moment. Not because I didn't know, I'd known for weeks, I just hadn't been asked. "Honesty," I said. "Not everything. I don't need to know your business or your history. But if something involves me, if my name is in it, or my safety, or my position here, I need to know. Not after, during." "Done," he said. "And I work," I said. "This is still a job. I'm not a fixture in your life. I'm not a person you fold into your story because it's convenient. I have a story of my own." "I know you do," he said. "I've been watching you live it for 5 weeks." Something in the plainness of that stopped me, the absence of performance in it. He wasn't trying to be charming. He was just accurate. The way he was always accurate about everything, about everyone, and apparently about me more than I'd realized. "All right," I said. "All right," he said. We stood there for another minute. The city had fully committed to mourning by now, bright and loud, and indifferent to everything happening 43 floors above it. I went back inside to unpack my bag. It didn't take long. I hadn't gotten very far. I hung the gray shirt back in the wardrobe and stood looking at it for a moment. This ordinary thing I'd bought from a market stall. This small evidence that I'd been here long enough to accumulate something. I wasn't safe. He'd said so himself, and I'd believed him because it was the truth, and we'd agreed on truth. But I was standing on ground I'd chosen, with terms I'd set, in a life that was still entirely mine. That was enough. That was, if I was being fully honest with myself, more than I'd had in a very long time. I closed the wardrobe and went to start the kitchen. There was work to do. There always was. And for the first time in 5 weeks, maybe longer, I was glad to be the one doing it here.